And a very good morning to you. We're live from London. You're with Monocle on Sunday with me, Emma Nelson. In the programme today, my guests share their views on the week's biggest stories. Nina dos Santos looking ready for a run around the park. What have you spotted?
Well, one of the stories that I'm most interested in is a piece in The Times that appears to be an exclusive, where they think they might have caught one of the donors to one of Prince William's charities, claiming that she could be able to sell access to the prince for as little as £20,000. The palace, of course, say that they were not aware of this, but of course it is reminiscent of the similar sort of scandals that his father faced when he was the heir apparent a few years ago.
Thank you for that. We'll also get the latest from Ljubljana.
It's sweltering all across the Western Balkans, and there's heat of a different kind on the streets of Belgrade. I'm Monocle's man in the Balkans, Guy De Launey, and I'll have a roundup of the latest from the region.
We understand Guy will be poolside. It's the 29th of June 2025, live from London. This is Monocle on Sunday.
Live from London, this is Monocle on Sunday with Emma Nelson.
Very good morning to you all. No Tyler today. He is in Canada, so we are holding the fort for him for a whole hour. Nina dos Santos, Charles Hecker. How are we doing? Welcome. Nice to see you both. Well, who wants to kick off first with what they've been doing this week? Nina, you've been flying around. I've been flying about as well. It's been quite good fun.
That's right. I've been in Mougins in the south of France, which has been lovely, somewhere I've been going to for quite some time. Visiting a friend who has become one of the exodus of Londoners who has decided that, the UK isn't the place with as many opportunities as she and her husband might have felt, and that the tax situation is onerous, and they can't get the education for their children that they want. And so, like lots of sort of the international mobile, they decided to become internationally mobile. But the benefit of that is that I can go and see them somewhere nice on purely selfish basis,
Absolutely.
I must say.
And how's Les Mougins looking this week?
Well, full of people like that, I must say. Unfortunately, London is one of these places that competes, though, at the moment on weather, thanks to global warming. It appears as though we're basking in the sunshine, giving places like the south of France a bit of a run for their money, because it's quite beautiful here and getting emptier, which actually is a bit of a bonus.
I was absolutely baking in Paris this week. It was hotter than here in London. I'm okay with it. I'm quite happy with it. We got caught in the great downpour. There was this huge storm on Wednesday night that was quite sad, actually, because everybody was gathering in a big square near the Grand Palais for a very beautiful drinks party I think it was for Acne. And weeks and weeks and months of hard work and preparation, guest lists and preening and making people look and feel beautiful was literally blasted out by a storm in 30 seconds flat. It was wondrous
like the
to
Olympics,
watch,
wasn't it? I think the same thing happened.
Wondrous to watch, but just such a sort of an abrupt end. And then we all got drowned rats and all our clothes felt like they'd come out of the washing machine. So that was super fun. But Charles Hecker, I could never get it right, never shall, never will. You're sort of in crisis heat mode. So this is the only person in the world who, actually, let's think about it. You've lived in Russia for a very, very long time. So are we now are you a minus numbers kind of guy?
I deal a lot better with the cold than I do with the heat. Let's put it that way. I have been sort of in hunker down heat avoidance mode for most of the week, doing what I can to sort of sit by the fan and with the shades down. But I've been sort of revisiting my sort of Russian commercial roots over the past few days. I was at a phenomenal book launch party earlier this week at the launch of a book by Andrei Soldatov and Irina Baragan called Our Dear Friends in Moscow. Andrei and Irina are sort of campaigning journalists who've been writing for years about the Russian security services and are now writing in exile. And they wrote a book about how their similar sort of campaigning journalism and sort of activist journalist friends in Russia, those that remain there, have now switched over to, as they say, to the dark side. And it's a phenomenal, important book. It was great to be at the launch party. And then later in the week, I attended a bit of a reunion of individuals who were doing business in Russia in the 1990s. And we got together to reminisce, to socialize, to knock back a few hamburgers and a couple of pints.
I love very Russian food. Excellent, good Russian
yes,
food.
Yes, hamburgers and pints.
I'm going to say something much more Russian.
No. Well, it was very English. It was sort of in the center of town, outdoors, taking advantage of the fantastic weather, and a bit of time to discuss and reminisce, but also think about the difficult situation that we find ourselves in vis-a-vis Russia at the moment.
Difficult in what way? The fact that people don't. I know at the end of your book, Zero Sum, you talk about this sort of circling of big companies deciding when they should go back in. Is that now very much a live discussion?
It was an extremely live discussion earlier this year, I would say in sort of March, April, when President Trump and President Putin started talking to each other across the hotline. And when you had Lavrov and Rubio, the Russian and American secretaries of state, foreign ministers, meeting in Riyadh, and America looked like it was on a course towards normalizing its relations with Russia, and the U.S. business community was absolutely on fire with discussions about going back to Russia. One of the difficult things that we were discussing at this reunion, of course, is what's happening in Ukraine, and now that it doesn't seem that there is any chance of an immediate ceasefire in Ukraine or any chance of normalization of relations between Russia and the United States, the appetite for the return, or at least the discussion about going back, has sort of gone off the boil. But it is there just beneath the surface, and should a moment ever present itself again, I think you will find not just American companies, but probably even more European companies going back to Russia the moment they get the chance.
You've talked about two great moments of pragmatism there. The idea that the journalists who are able to speak freely about what is happening in Russia are forced into exile and publish a book about it because their colleagues have effectively just decided that, well, explain to us the reasons why people have decided to go to what you describe as the dark side. And then also you're talking about your business colleagues and your friends who are knowing that actually the world continues to turn.
So there's always a big difference and a bit of a cleaving between people who leave and people who remain. And it's the same goes for individuals as it does for businesses. And it's actually quite reminiscent of the Soviet period, when you had individuals who, dissidents who stayed in Russia and dissidents who left Russia. And it was also very interesting, to dwell just for a moment again on books. Another phenomenal book has been published recently that won the Pulitzer Prize in the United States this year and won the Pushkin House Book Prize this year. And it's called To the Success of Our Fruitless Venture. I think I've just mangled the title. I'm going to have to Google it and come back to you on that. But anyway.
Shall I do that for you now while you're talking?
Yes, it was written by a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, my alma mater, called Benjamin Nathans, and it was about the Soviet dissident movement. And the parallels between the Soviet dissident movement and the Russian dissident movement are in many cases remarkable, and in other cases perhaps not so surprising. And so Irina and Andrei left and are writing what they write in the relative comfort, although not entirely for them, the relative comfort for the West. There remain dissident journalists in Russia who remain there at their great peril, but an equal number of Russian journalists have become even more vocal supporters of the regime and are living there under those conditions.
There appears to have been quite a lot of activity by the Russian opposition just in June at the start of this month. There were a couple of parliamentary committees and events in Parliament with the Russian opposition, like the Russian Democratic Society hosting events, and then sort of movie premieres by dissident filmmakers and so on and so forth. And a week or so before, we also had the Ukrainians in town, didn't we, trying to sort of, focus minds ahead of that key NATO and EU summit that took place last week. I suppose the difficulty is that, the longer these people are outside of Russia, the easier it is for Russia to discredit anything they say as being completely obsolete, right?
That's right. This is one of the things that happens, and I don't know if this is typical of other countries, but it is very much representative of what happened in the Soviet Union, and it's very much representative of what's happening in Russia, and that is individuals who leave the country ultimately sacrifice, I suspect, a certain amount of legitimacy in the eyes of people who remain. And the longer you stay out of the country, no matter how close you are in touch with people of various roles and positions in Russian society or in Russian government, the more tenuous those connections become. And this is one of the greatest and deepest, and you can sense one of the most burning regrets of individuals who leave, and many of whom did this because their personal safety was threatened, not because they sort of felt like it would be a good idea, but because they had to leave. But they understand what they're sacrificing in terms of the validity of their own cause once they leave. And I just want to correct the title of the book. I get no commission, by the way, out of plugging all these books on the air, but I'm kind of feeling in book mode these days. It's called To the Success of Our Hopeless Cause, The Many Lives of the Soviet Dissident Movement, and it's the winner of the Pulitzer Prize in the U.S. and the Pushkin House Book Prize here in the U.K.
It's an interesting idea that you raise in terms of the legitimacy of a dissident. There's an amazing article in the New York Times today. A former political prisoner in Belarus with her son saying, "I'm still stuck in psychological crisis. The system is designed not just to break you inside prison, but after you have left." And it refers to Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who has left Belarus. Her husband has now been released, but you almost feel as if she's sort of reduced to a circuit speaker, which just seems desperately sad because nothing can be done from the outside about Belarus.
Well, I think Svetlana Tikhanovskaya actually has remained a reasonably potent political force in exile to the extent that she has maintained and supported a certain amount of visibility for Belarusian dissidents, a group of individuals who typically are overlooked and overshadowed by what's happening in Russia and what's happening in Ukraine. She is an extremely effective voice for her country and, welcome in political circles everywhere around the world. I suppose ultimately she's hoping to return to Belarus because, of course, she was sort of the losing candidate in a presidential election that was, very obviously rigged and most likely was, in fact, the winning candidate. But those votes were suppressed. So she has, a sort of claim to a political role in Belarus. She ran instead of her husband, who you correctly point out was recently released from jail as a result of some intervention from the United States. She ran to replace her husband, whose candidacy was ended when he was thrown in jail.
And it opens a broader question, doesn't it, Nina, about the ability of the West to report on events which are unspeakably bad. I mean, there are huge struggles to get anything accurately reported out of Belarus, and we've seen the Israelis making it impossible for accurate reporting to be done from inside Gaza, and Iran as well. I mean, we saw the BBC correspondent Lise Doucet pop up in Tehran last week, much to a lot of people's surprise. That difficulty that a modern-day reporter faces to actually get access on the ground to what is really happening, and then that subsequent reliance on people inside who may or may not be reliable sources, but they are the only ones that we've got to go on to tell the story.
That's right. And there's this new form of journalism that appears to have replaced a lot of source-based journalism in the meantime. You see it at BBC, for instance, with their new Verify product. And that is essentially click and capture an image, which I'm also concerned about because we shouldn't necessarily be relying on sort of one-dimensional, internet leads from the comfort of an office here in the West. You actually have to go to these places to meet people to understand the context. And the great thing about people like Lise Doucet, who I've known for some time, is that she does have the understanding of what it's like to be in these places, even if, say, 10, 15 years later, you can't actually go there. She does know what it's like to have been there in the first place. And unfortunately, because of the economics of the journalism industry and also the increasing rise of autocracy and many governments that would have allowed journalists free rein, like, for instance, you mentioned Israel before, or some journalists free rein, are now curtailing those abilities. We've got this twin problem here where people are relying upon very cost-effective types of one-dimensional journalism and at the same time also permitting world leaders to not give them access and not shame them enough. And the other difficulty as well for people like the team you were talking about before, Andrei Soldatov and Irina Bogodin, the problem is that they also may well get targeted and harassed here in the UK. The UK is a place where Russia has gone for journalists and tried to potentially harass, harm or kill them. And so it's quite difficult for them to ply their trade whilst also being allegedly discredited for being outside of Russia for quite some time. That's
right. I mean, I think that most of the journalists who have left Russia and are reporting, whether it's from London or from Berlin, or the Moscow Times, for example, which is now based in Amsterdam and reporting in exile online. I think all of them have gone to extraordinary measures to protect their personal safety, to protect their online safety, and to protect the safety of their product. And that involves avoiding physical threats and also avoiding a non-stop sort of onslaught of electronic and cyber threats against the most effective publishing means that anybody has these days, which is now to be online and on the internet.
Let's talk a little bit about the news that's coming out of the Taiwanese vice president, and it's born along the same lines. It just sparked a thought in my head that the vice president has said she will not be intimidated by China, because she was in Prague and she said that Chinese diplomats and Secret Service followed her and planned to intimidate her physically. Now, the fact that we have that happening on European soil is very worrying, isn't it?
It is. Now, this particular case is quite interesting. So the allegation is that China had planned a car collision during the Taiwanese vice president's visit to Prague, and that the intelligence authorities in Czechia had spotted this and, alerted people. The reality is that also, there have been some very prominent Czech politicians who have spoken out against concerns, that the People's Republic of China, is trying to, it's human rights abuses, allegations of human rights abuses and so on. And also there's a very, very prominent Czech politician who's at the centre of the Interparliamentary Alliance on China, this big cross-parliament international lobby group that's very hawkish on China. So it's not surprising that this may have happened inside a place like the Czech Republic. But it is quite concerning here. And it also speaks to previous allegations that emerged a few years ago in places like the Netherlands, and also I think it was Australia as well, where there were allegations that Chinese dissidents had been accused of planting fake bombs, but the phone calls had been made allegedly by sort of, agents of the PRC saying this person has planted a bomb or this person has done this or that wrong. And it's these sort of very complicated twists and plots to try and frame people who are either dissidents or, in this case, a legitimately elected Taiwanese representative visiting Europe.
This is astonishing stuff, given the fact that the European Union is trying to work out what to do with Beijing. And the fact that there's an enormous amount of trade investment and what have you. I mean, obviously there are phenomenally difficult issues to unpick with that. But the fact that the Chinese feel as if they can just do this on Czech soil.
Yeah, I mean, just think about it. I mean, you don't have to think too far back in contemporary British history to realize that the Russians penetrated the United Kingdom and killed Alexander Litvinenko with polonium and tried to poison Yulia and Sergei Skripal with Novichok. The first poisoning succeeded, the second failed. It is remarkable how open our territories are to this sort of infiltration. And you're absolutely right that the vulnerability that this creates on the political, the commercial, the diplomatic, the geopolitical front is potentially catastrophic.
Yeah, because they're all going to be sort of sitting and looking at their shoes and the next time they meet each other. You're just thinking, how is that diplomatic meeting going to be between Czech Republic and Beijing at any point? Do they say, could you please stop trying to orchestrate car crashes in central Prague, please?
Well, I mean, remember, Lithuania had a very strained relationship with China, didn't they, over their decision to recognise Taiwan and give it some sort of diplomatic footprint in Vilnius. Now, the government in Lithuania has changed since then, but that had all sorts of enormous economic ramifications for Lithuania in particular. I remember the Financial Times about 2-3 years ago ran this enormous 2-page piece by Lithuanian business lobbies, that were in the technology industry saying, well, look, this decision to take a stance on Taiwan has completely wrong-footed the industry in Lithuania and means that Beijing has cut off all trade ties with us. Remember when Beijing also punished Australia by not buying its wine for a while over similar issues. So Beijing sometimes uses the less lethal version, which is trade, as a weapon here. But I suppose the real concern here is you're talking about a representative from Taiwan visiting a European Union country, and there's allegations that they could have come to physical harm because China may well have been planning to orchestrate a car crash, and that is coming from the intelligence authorities of a European Union country. It is alarming because it would mean a step change in the behaviour of Beijing from here.
You're listening to Monocle on Sunday with me, Emma Nelson, in the studio, Charles Hecker and Nina dos Santos. What have we all spotted? I've spotted the thing about the Taiwanese. What did Chuck? What have you got?
I thought that a Sunday, a sort of sunny, warm Sunday in London in the morning, might be an interesting time to just take a moment to look back on political events this week in New York City. Where I thought it was interesting to look at, and he's everywhere. I mean, it's not just me who's interested in this. The global media is interested in this from everywhere in the United States, everyone around Europe and the rest of the world, is looking very, very carefully at the meteoric political rise of Zohran Mamdani, who, just a few months ago was a political nobody with zero name recognition and was a representative to the state assembly in the state of New York, who launched a candidacy in the Democratic primary to become the mayor of New York City. And so what happened was, from going to 1% name recognition, he won the Democratic primary and ran away with it.
How did he do it?
So this is how he did it. And this is what people are looking at. First of all, what people are saying about Zohran Mamdani is that he was incredibly authentic, that he's a young, sort of hard-charging political upstart who is not a processed product of focus groups or political handlers, and that he is who he is, and he gets out there and speaks his mind. The other thing is that he was absolutely ubiquitous. He was on every social media channel imaginable and went to every single neighborhood, in fact, crisscrossed Manhattan on foot, and enlisted an army of volunteers who, he says, knocked on 1.5 million doors. I mean, this is an individual who literally went viral. The way he dresses is being dissected. The rings on his fingers are being, examined for their semiotic signals. His use of language, including the fact that he campaigned periodically in Spanish. He became a movement. He became a phenomenon. He caught fire with young progressive Democrats across New York City. And of course, the Democratic primary is essentially the proxy for the general election.
Tell me a little bit more, though, about the setting for New York. The fact is that as soon as I heard this story, I immediately thought of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Yeah.
Right.
New York. And one wonders whether New York is where this happens.
So AOC is a big backer of Mamdani. And I guess beyond what happened in New York City, because of the current state of disarray in the Democratic Party following the defeat of Kamala Harris, the Democrats are saying, well, this is it. This is the bellwether, that New York City and Zohran Mamdani is the bellwether for the Democratic Party nationally. And I think this is one of the reasons why I wanted to bring this article to everyone's attention, and that is that I can't help but scratch my head and wonder when New York City has ever been the bellwether or is being held up as the bellwether for what happens in the rest of the United States. Because if there is one of the most sort of hated or sort of suspiciously regarded places in the United States, it's New York, second perhaps only to California, that most people sort of like to look at best from a safe distance. I just don't quite understand how a reasonably far left progressive, who, by the way, campaigned on bread and butter issues like the affordability of living in New York City, but nevertheless touched on a number of controversial progressive Democratic far left points, how this is suddenly now the template for the Democrats going forward.
I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because at the same time, obviously, not to, lose the limelight, Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, decided to launch an enormous lawsuit against Fox News just the other day, saying that they libeled him and he's the other bellwether, isn't he, for the Democratic Party, not on that very, very progressive left side, the Bernie Sanders side of the party, or AOC, for instance. But I think New York, as you pointed out, Charles, it's a great city of contradictions, isn't it? And I think it's really suffering from those contradictions right now. It's another big, as somebody who's born and bred in another big metropolis, London myself, you can see New York as the ultimate city of inequality, and to a certain extent, it's kind of paying for that here. And I think Andrew Cuomo, who of course has always been one of the big political titans on the scene in New York, was completely wrong-footed by the rise of Zohran Mamdani here. I think traditional members of the Democratic Party are paying the price, aren't they, for not allowing some of these more progressive voices to have a bit more skin in the game and a little bit more of a voice in the debate. And then New York is one of those cities where you have very, very, very rich and very, very poor, cheek by jowl. More and more of the rich people are leaving, and they're not necessarily voting in these primaries. They're moving to places like Miami.
That's right. And they're starting to vote, I think, with their wallets. And that is that now, as a result of Mamdani's resounding triumph in the primaries, there is a group of, and his part of his campaign was taxing corporations and taxing wealthy New Yorkers, neither of which go down very well with either of those two groups. And so those two groups, those two constituencies are sort of getting together and thinking about whether they can either try to return Cuomo to the race or support Eric Adams, who we haven't yet mentioned, who is a Democrat and who is the incumbent. But was seen as such a disastrous potential candidate that he didn't run in the Democratic primary and is very clearly making noises about running as an independent in the general election in November. And so here you have sort of wealthy New Yorkers and corporate donors thinking, well, we should probably support the incumbent, who everybody sort of sotto voce detests just as much as they do the rest of them. What the other thing that's interesting about this is that in the nation's largest city, in a city of something like 10 million people, the three leading politicians in Democratic circles right now are, first of all, Cuomo, who was hounded out of office under widespread allegations that he was a sex pest, and also under sort of reasonably chunky allegations that he was corrupt in office. And then you move to Eric Adams, who himself was under a corruption investigation, had the charges dropped by the Trump administration, and it was very clearly a quid pro quo for his sort of assistance in Trump's immigration policy in New York City. And then you have Zohran Mamdani. Forgive me, he has a reasonably simple last name to pronounce that I know nevertheless managed to mangle. Zohran Mamdani, who, rather controversially in New York City, said that he supported the use of the phrase "globalize the Intifada." How did we wind up with these three individuals as the leading candidates for mayor in the nation's largest city?
Because we're in a world where you have absolute, the absolute extreme political figures that seem to make the loudest noises.
But what, Charles? I'd be interested to know, as an American, what you think this says about the future of New York City. Because when we opened this show, I was just pointing out that I'd been to stay at a friend's place who's born and bred in London, like me, I went to school with, but has become one of the exodus, right? And London itself is facing this question mark over whether or not, on a much, much smaller scale, whether or not trickle-down economics ever really worked for London, and whether when all those people with their sort of corporate interests leave, you end up just with a city that gets poorer and poorer and has to tax people more and more, and, wages just don't compensate for living costs and so on and so forth. But that dynamic is so extreme in New York.
Yeah.
Is it going to go the same way as Detroit and places like that?
New York is probably too big to fail. And every time people try to sort of write New York City's obituary or epitaph, it turns out to be premature. New York City is a juggernaut. And you're absolutely right, Nina. I mean, it is an unstable molecule of a juggernaut. Sorry, I'm mixing my metaphors here. It's the heat, I promise you. But in spite of its contrasts, in spite of its tensions, or perhaps maybe even because of them, New York sort of marches on. and still remains an incredibly dynamic city. I think living in New York is hard work. And I think it's hard work even if you have the enormous amounts of money that it takes to live comfortably in New York. I think that the standard of living is lower than London. And I think it's lower than a lot of cities that are comparable in size. And I think the amount of money that it takes to live there comfortably is much higher than in a lot of other cities. But it is still this sort of boiling, not melting pot, but boiling pot of civilizations. And I think that's what keeps it alive.
It is interesting, though. I'm just leafing through our quality of life issue here. Monocle. It's come out, and we all know that Paris gets best for best all rounder, and they're slightly smaller cities. We have Athens, great at nightlife. Barcelona, great for urban greening. Vienna, best for housing. That size that the smaller, manageable city can deal with it. But there is that overarching thing. I mean, Tokyo does incredibly well for cleanliness, which is a joy to behold. And Tokyo is absolutely massive, but standing out in Paris this week, and I was talking to one gentleman who is who's French but lives in London or has lived in London and is just about to move to New York City, and has said that actually London now is no longer good value, and that's something that people completely that often we over or underestimate. I'm not quite sure, but you think actually if you are going to pay a premium for it, are you actually going to get that feeling that you could only get that in London or only get that in New York? And he's moving to New York because he says it's actually better value.
I think this is the crucial issue. I think this is where the political earthquakes come from. It's this perception of there being a deficit of opportunity, that the opportunity isn't there in such sufficient scale to compensate for the persistent costs, rising costs of living. And also, in the United States, it's slightly different because wages have accelerated apace quite significantly recently. But in the UK, they haven't. And so I can totally understand the dynamic vis-à-vis London. Also, in France, if you compare it with Paris, London and Paris, French companies are more heavily regulated. There's a lot more subsidies. So, perhaps not net on the salary packet, but on the benefits, it actually is worthwhile. I wonder, with regards to New York, whether or not this is where Zoran Mamdani's support is coming from. Lots of people feeling the opportunity isn't there, and they live paycheck to paycheck.
Yeah, I mean, his support was actually was citywide. I mean, there were very few sort of patches that didn't have part of his sort of stamp on it, and in the color coded map of his victory, it was fairly widespread. Emma, you will never see London in a list of most livable cities or best cities to live. It will never hold its own against places like Zurich or Vienna or Helsinki or Tokyo, or places that sort of typically populate those rankings. But since the robust air conditioning of Studio One here in Monocle Radio has kicked in.
It's the only reason why you came in this morning.
It's one of the reasons why I came in this morning, and it's kicked in, and I'm now beginning to think a little bit more clearly as a result of the plummeting temperature in the studio. And when people say things like such and such is no longer a good value, and I particularly get wound up about this when people say that about college educations, but I can understand that London may not be a good value, or New York may not be value for money anymore, but perhaps only and exclusively in the financial expression. I literally find walking the streets of London to be an inspirational experience every day. And I think most of what I derive out of being a Londoner and living here for God knows how long are things that I never have to pay for. And that is what I think is most inspirational about living here. And I think the same is probably the case for New York. I've never been a New Yorker. I was born in New York City, but grew up in the burbs. But as a reasonably proud and sort of diehard Londoner, most of what I enjoy about the city are things that I do not have to pay for.
Thank you for that. The time here in London is 9:33 a.m. Let us head to Guy De Launey, Monocle's Balkan correspondent. A very good morning to you, Guy. An interesting question is, where are you?
Well, I'm not at the swimming pool anymore, which is where I expected to be. Sorry about that, Emma. I got dragged out of the swimming pool to do some live TV about how hot it is. Now, there's an irony, isn't it? And I did mull to myself over whether I could actually do it from the swimming pool. Well, I wasn't going to subject the viewers to the horror of me in a swimming cosy in my Speedos on a Sunday morning. That
sounds like you're being paid too much, Guy.
Yeah, right. It's a municipal swimming pool. It's a very
Okay.
good municipal swimming pool. But I have to say, and this is one of the reasons I wanted to do it, was because we're talking about quality of life. And one of the things that I find improves your quality of life is the quality of swimming pools in your city. And Ljubljana has an absolutely excellent outdoor swimming pool where I was this morning called Kalesia. And it cost me €6 to go in. And when I say it's an excellent outdoor swimming pool, it's 50 meters. So that's Olympic length. It's got half of it set out in lanes if you want to swim some laps, which I did, or the other half just for poodling about or playing, which a lot of people also want to do. And then loads of sunbeds around the side, nice wooden decking, an upper area, beach volleyball, table tennis, and a nice little cafe. What more do you want for your €6 on a Sunday morning, I'm
going to bring in Charles Hecker for this one, because he just talked about the idea that the joyful thing about living in London is you can have the pleasures that money can't buy. I mean, I'm going to come in with you on this one, Guy. A few weeks ago, I paid £8 to spend the afternoon by the lake at Abadi. Everything is there. It's all laid out. It's absolutely fine. I haven't had that happen to me in London. Okay, we don't have a lake, but the idea of the local municipal swimming pool as the great bellwether. Actually, we're going to put this forward to the next quality of life thing. Who has a good swimming pool? There are no good swimming pools for £8 in London.
There are amazing swimming pools.
Oh, hang on.
Pools.
I'm taking you to the London Fields Lido, and we're going to have an experience that I think last time I went, which was quite some time ago, I have to confess. I walk by regularly, but I walk in rarely. But it was £3.50, and it is gorgeous.
Okay. I love you dearly, Charles Hecker. I'm never taking my clothes off in front of you. How about... We're never going swimming. Nina looks shocked and horrified.
Well, yeah, where I was last week, I mean, forget it, €50 for one sun lounger.
€50 for a sun lounger?
In the south of France.
You pay for beauty?
By the way, I refused to pay that. And I lived in Italy for many years, like 5.5 years. And it's the same thing over there with the stabilimenti balneari, as they call, the beach clubs, and other, €50-100 for to change, to take your clothes off, albeit in private, Emma, and put some more dry ones on. All that's far too expensive for me. I honestly think that these things, should be cost effective. Look, we are in the confines of W1 here in Midori House, just a stone's throw away from Baker Street Station. I grew up right here in this area in a square next door, and I used to go to the Seymour Leisure Centre.
Closed at the moment.
I was sent to the local leisure centre for about 10 years to learn to swim as a kid. It wasn't the most glamorous place, and it was indoors. But I think it's been sold off now.
It's being it's being renovated. It's going to be beautiful. It's going to be fabulous.
And
in London,
swimming pool?
Yes.
And a cost-effective one?
No idea. Probably not. Guy De Launey, pile in on this one.
I will, because I've experienced the Seymour pool. I've been there. It's lovely. I mean, it's a proper Victorian pool, and you sort of learn that these things are, they were measured in feet, so they got these very odd lengths in like 33.3 meters because they were 100 feet or something like that. I think that's how the maths works. So the Seymour, and then there's another good one in Soho called Marshall Street Baths. And then the one I really I shouldn't really bring this to anybody's attention because it's not exactly a well-kept secret, but it is fabulous, which is Oasis in Holborn, which is outdoors and heated. And it's heated all year round. So you can go there in the winter and have a perfectly fine dip. Even when the temperatures outside are frosty, or in the summer, you can swim up and down or do what a lot of people do, which is just, again, toast themselves on the sunbeds round and about.
Okay, Monocle Quality of Life Best for Swimming Pools competition for next year. Guy, I've actually completely forgotten any of the subjects you wanted to talk to us about because I've been so distracted by the idea of going swimming with Charles Hecker. What else? What have you? What do you want to bring to our attention today?
Well, look, I mean, obviously it's hot. I mean, the thing we've covered that sort of, haven't we? But it's been unusually hot to the extent that in Serbia they reported their highest temperatures since records began in the 19th century. That's a bit worrying, isn't it? And it's been getting very high here in Ljubljana. We were pushing towards 40 last week. We had a bit of rain, which has cooled things down a bit. A mere 35 degrees today in the shade. But it's going to get hotter again during the week. So this is something which is causing a lot of concern for everybody, frankly. And we know it's only going to get worse going forward because a study has been made which suggests that of all the EU capitals, Ljubljana is going to experience the greatest temperature increase in terms of the peak average by 2050. And that's going to be an increase of 8 degrees for Ljubljana, as against the EU average of 3.5 degrees. So it's going to be a city you're going to have to think about how you're going to live here. And, they have been putting in the water fountains, the sort of ornamental kind, which cool down the streets, but also the drinking fountains for people and their pets. They've been sprouting up round and about. I notice now that pretty much all the bus stops have green roofs as well these days. So, they are thinking about it, and it's a fairly green city as it is. But I'm not sure I would like to be here in 2050, frankly.
Indeed. The reason why Ljubljana is going to jump up by such a large number of degrees is what?
I don't know quite. It's presumably, because of where it's situated. I mean, the funny thing is, when people think about Yugoslavia, they often have the Iron Curtain in mind, because when Churchill talked about the Iron Curtain, his original definition had Yugoslavia behind it. And then that sort of changed when Tito broke with Stalin in 1949, and the Iron Curtain shifted, if you like. But I think a lot of people still have in their minds that it's Eastern Europe and East equals cold. And it's nothing of the sort. I mean, our neighbours here are Italy and Croatia, and Austria and Hungary, of course, as well. But, we're in a fairly warm spot as it is, and which is very nice when you're on Lake Bohinj or next to the Adriatic at Isola or something like that. But, when it gets the kind of temperatures that you do get these days in this part of the world, it's very, very unpleasant indeed.
Let's move on to another story about protests. In Serbia, they have been having huge protests once again to try to get President Vučić to stand down. I mean, this is the latest chapter in a very, very long-running story, which is not going anywhere in many ways, is it?
It is not. So this goes back to the start of November last year, when we had the disaster at Novi Sad railway station. Novi Sad is Serbia's second city, and Novi Sad railway station was a key part of the country's signature infrastructure project, which is the Belgrade to Budapest high-speed railway line. I mean, I'd been to Novi Sad railway station. I'd actually stood on the canopy which collapsed in November, killing 16 people. And I was standing on that canopy watching President Vučić and Viktor Orban of Hungary opening the station and talking about what a great thing it would be. That's why we've had these protests. If you're going to make a big song and dance about how you're making the country better, and this is one of our key projects, if not our signature project, and then that kills 16 people, then you've got to answer some questions properly. And the protests have been saying all the way along, you haven't answered the questions. There hasn't been accountability. That's what we want. We want proper investigations, prosecutions, and real answers about what's going on, and whether, as a lot of people suspect, corruption and shortcuts and general incompetence were the causes of the disaster. And all of this has been led by students. Students have not really allowed politics, or at least political parties, to come into it. They've now pivoted to demanding elections, because they say the government and President Vučić simply aren't showing any signs of acceding to the demands. And on Saturday night, we had, I think it's the second largest demonstration during these 8 months of protests that we've seen. Estimate of about 140,000 people out in the centre of Belgrade last night. And you can look at it in a couple of ways. Well, this isn't as many as 325,000, which is what we had at the last big demonstration march, but it's still the second largest demonstration in Serbia's history. So clearly a lot of people still wanting things to change in the country.
Vučić is not budging, though.
No, he's not. He said you're not going to get elections right now, maybe in December 2026. And in many respects, why should he budge? His Progressive Party were elected with a very handy majority in December of 2023. So that's only a year and a half ago. And that party is still really, when you look at the Serbian political scene, it's still the only coherent proposition for voters to choose at the ballot box. The opposition is fractured. There's a lot of egos involved. Nobody's really willing to set those egos aside and join together in a political force which could present a credible alternative for voters. And that's an issue which the students aren't going to be able to solve by themselves. And this is a big question. They've shown they can mobilize. They've shown they can get the respect of a lot of people. and that they've been able to carry on these protests with a lot of stamina for 8 months without a lot of violence. And, you have to give credit to the authorities there as well, that there generally has been a soft touch when it comes to policing these protests, although perhaps less so last night. But they haven't provided the political answers. And that's what Serbia has been short of for the past 12 years or 13 years since Mr. Vučić and his party took power.
Let's move to Poland, or rather a new rail link from Poland. And I know that we often talk about things not happening, and we often talk about infrastructure getting a bit messy, but we can delightfully announce that trains are running, or a train link is running. That is a good thing.
This is a good thing. And I see a lot of Poles in Croatia. I generally find myself, I'm going a bit later this year, but every year for the past 6 years, I think now, we've been popping over to a lovely town called Lovran on the Kvarner coast in Croatia. So this is just about half an hour away from Rijeka, which is the country's third city and its largest port. And there is now, the first one arrived yesterday, a direct rail link between Warsaw and Rijeka. And that means that there'll be fewer people arriving with Polish number plates on the Kvarner coast this year. But on the one hand, I've got to tell you, Emma, that the price is right. So prices start from 45 euros. If you want to get a place in a couchette, it's from about 65 euros. But do you know how long this thing takes? 20 hours.
Okay.
Now, that's quite a commitment, isn't it?
It's bananas. And what would that require for, let's say, an aircraft replacement? You've absolutely knocked me sideways by that comment. So are we looking at competition now being mounted by local airlines?
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. There are airports in the vicinity. I mean, Rijeka has a perfectly decent airport on the island of Krk, which is actually very handy for a lot of actual sandy beaches, which are a bit of a rarity on our side of the Adriatic. And there's also an airport at Pula, which is in Istria, which again is very close to Rijeka as well. So yeah, if you had a direct air link between one of those airports and Warsaw, I'd say, yeah, no brainer, get on that. But Wizz Air hasn't. It seems to have pulled out of a few. I mean, it's not in Ljubljana anymore, for example. And Wizz Air was a nice, handy carrier for linking places around here with Eastern Europe and other places further afield as well. And it doesn't seem to be operating certain lines. So at the moment, actually, the rail option does have a certain degree of sanity to it, even though the length of the journey would be, let's face it, a test of endurance. I mean, you're going to spend some of that time asleep. It sets off at about 2 PM and arrives about, I think, 10 the following morning. But yeah, you're going to be awake for some of it, for sure.
Guy De Launey, back in the pool with you. Thank you so much for joining us. And the birds, too, in Ljubljana. They're chirping away quite merrily. It's 9:48 here in London. Nina dos Santos, Charles Hacker, what would you do for 20 hours on a train? I suddenly actually thought that was a really nice thing.
I'd finally get the chance to finish Charles Hecker's book, which I took with me to the south of France and in 3 days couldn't get through.
Could there possibly be anything better to do on a train? And also, and when it comes time to fall asleep, that might be what you want to do to help you sort of drive the final nail in.
What are you going to do for 20 hours
I would do a
train?
bit of reading. I would probably do a tiny bit of drinking. I love train ride, though. I mean, a 20-hour train is pushing it, but I could see giving it a go just to see if I can survive.
Is this a slightly, I'm not going to say older thing. Oh, I just have. It was something that is deeply loved by people who quite like to sit down for longer than they like to stand up. I am at the moment engaged in a bitter, door-slamming, swearing degree of war about where we go on holiday this year. We're now we're at the end of June and we still haven't made up our minds. It is phenomenally bad. And I'm making great, lovely plans about, well, let's get on a train, let's get the train to Paris, and let's get the train down to Arcachon because it's a TGV, and then we can just go absolutely anywhere we like. And the family is looking at me and like, why are you making us do such bad things? We want to go on a plane to Ibiza. Who's right, Nina dos Santos?
Summer. Arcachon. I was in Arcachon a month ago, actually.
Right.
And it is beautiful because it's a little bay on the Atlantic. You know, those erstwhile other sort of windy shores of the Atlantic are completely protected. You're completely protected from that in the Bay d'Arcachon. So it's like a combination between Deauville with those sort of big sort of Norman-type houses, albeit not entirely the same, with the south of France as weather. And there's loads to do for kids. The problem is that Ibiza's just so much sexier, isn't it? Let's be honest.
I'm not quite sure how sexy I'm feeling. I don't know. Charles's face just was like, Arcachon, here we go. So basically, am I going on holiday with you, Charles, and everyone else can go to Ibiza? Nina's off with... You can have my family. That's fine. I don't care. Chuck and I are going off to go and walk along the promenade with a 20-hour train.
I'm about 40 years too late for Ibiza, I think.
I don't think you are nowadays.
Seriously?
I think we're all right. I think they've catered for the fact that people have grown up with that music, and so, you know, everyone pops a couple of ibuprofen, the crack cocaine of the over 50s, and off we go for a night of bouncing around in a club.
I'm curious to see what other people do in Ibiza. And of course, here's the thing about these holiday destinations, though, because what you hear about Ibiza and a lot of other places in the Med is that, well, you know, you need to avoid the south, but it's lovely in the north. And that makes me question, like, you know, is this place really worth visiting? And is it really as good as people say in the north when you have to avoid half of an island? I'm curious about Ibiza because, of course, it has a global reputation as the ultimate sort of party destination. And I'd like to know what all the fuss is about. I still don't know if that's going to get me there.
Okay, we can all go and have a look at Esvedra, the big hippie rock, and go funny in the head.
I think we're all past Mykonos. Let's just agree with that, shall we?
You know what? We're never past Mykonos.
Oh,
We're never past Mykonos.
I'm 40 years too late for Ibiza and 40 pounds too late for Mykonos, I think.
Yeah, and 40 quid too light in the wallet. Probably all of us, I think.
Okay, so where are we going? We're not going to Arcachon, that's for sure. Actually, no. Charles and I are going to be a couple of old ladies by the beach.
We're spending our summer holiday at the London Fields Lido, in sunglasses and flowery bathing caps, I think.
Indeed, and large dresses. I mean, I'm taking the tent. Right, what else do we want to talk about? Let's have a look at the other news. What was it that you've spotted, Nina?
I was quite interested in this exclusive report in the Sunday Times that, you know, you don't have to be a royal watcher to be interested in this. It's a bit of but it is interesting. They're claiming here that a royal donor to one of the Prince of Wales, that is now Prince William's foundations, has been sending around emails, or at least somebody on their behalf apparently sending around emails, saying that their foundation, if you pay £20,000, could get you access to, a very prestigious polo match with a guaranteed meeting with the Prince of Wales himself and the Princess of Wales, Princess Catherine. Now, the royal family have said, Kensington Palace have said that they thank the Times for having brought this to their attention and that this email that's gone round wasn't in any way sanctioned by them. But it's interesting because it just goes to show how many people who, will covet their relationships with the royal family and fund some of their foundations are quite keen to leverage those relationships for money. And, there were allegations that King Charles, when he was the Prince of Wales a few years ago, had accepted donations for redoing one of his properties, Dumfries House in Scotland, and that some of those individuals had, got access to the heir to the throne and had paid quite a lot of money. The valet of the king stepped down as a result, but now we've got the heir to the throne facing similar sort of allegations, and I think that's interesting.
How much would you pay for an audience with Prince William?
It's fine seeing him on television. That's about as close as I really need to get. I read this article, and I think it's great that Nina brought it to our attention, and for all of the different things that it exposes, and the Sunday Times has done us all a great service by printing in full the invitation to this event that says the experience includes refined luncheon, not luncheon, and free-flowing champagne. VIP polo matches in an intimate setting. Polo is not an intimate sport. Curated art exhibition by the Mondahar Gallery. And an invitation-only guest list of, and here's the abbreviation that kills me, it's UHNW. And you have to know to be able to decipher that as ultra-high net worth. Individuals, cultural icons, and luxury leaders. I mean, who falls for this rubbish? I really want to know who's saying, I can't wait, I'm packing my bags, and I'm making a beeline to this polo match in an intimate setting. And I want to meet cultural icons and luxury leaders. I mean, honestly, in the year 2025, that this stuff is out there is shocking to me.
If there was a polo match at Brockwell Lido, would you go to it?
Okay.
Would Prince William go to it?
Prince William and Princess Catherine are going to... Was it Victoria? Which Lido is it?
It's the London Fields Lido. The London Fields Lido. The chance of there being a polo... Hell will freeze over before there's a polo match in London Fields. Or literally there will have to be some sort of revolution one way or the other, either from the top down or from the bottom up, before there's polo in London Fields.
I don't know. I just think, just going back to the seriousness of this particular allegation.
Sorry, yeah.
No. I just think that, I totally agree with Charles's point there, where he's saying who would fall for this kind of gauche messaging. Also, which, by the way, was sent around as a circular on the website A Small World, which is a sort of private members club. It's been described by the Wall Street Journal as MySpace for millionaires. It's a Swiss-based company. But the reality is, the point I'm making, I suppose, here is that the royal family really needs to get with the times. Prince Andrew has faced all sorts of allegations surrounding his, ill-advised friendships, obviously, with the late paedophile Jeffrey Epstein, but more recently with Chinese business people who were subject to security warnings by the authorities in the UK. We had allegations that a Saudi businessman was able to circumvent some, if I'm not wrong, immigration issues that he faced in the UK, and developed a friendship with King Charles when he was the Prince of Wales, etc., etc., etc. And I think the royal family need to be better advised, that then, need to be aware that their name will be used at any opportunity by opportunists, and they have to be very, very careful about this.
Let's move on. Finally, the last couple of minutes that we can talk about. We can talk about smoking or travelling. What do we want to talk about?
Are the two mutually exclusive?
Absolutely not, because it's summertime and everything goes wrong. So two things are happening. Firstly, the European Union has ruled that people are able to take on a carry bag onto a plane, even on budget airlines, without having to pay that extra thing. And in France, from today, you can't smoke at a bus stop, which, Truck, you said is a terrible thing. As a former smoker in Russia, you measured out your life like Prufrock, not in coffees, not in I can't remember what Prufrock is, coffee spoons. In cigarettes.
The French have decided to outlaw smoking in areas where children might be exposed to secondhand smoke, and they're outlawing smoking on the beach, which I wholeheartedly support. As a former smoker, I once tried smoking on the beach and found it to be absolutely revolting, not to mention that you're using the entire beach as your ashtray. Smoking at bus stops, though, bus stops were one of the best places in the world to smoke because, first of all, there's this sort of game that you play with yourself, and that is, can I light up before the bus gets here? And then you think, well, how far away is the bus? Well, the bus is probably about 2 cigarettes away. So, you could enjoy yourself on the way there. And we marked time in the length of cigarettes. How long does it take to get from this place to that place? Oh, it's about 2 or 3 cigarettes.
One of my first bosses used to ask me to have a meeting with him in his office, which it turned out was a bus stop outside the office, for him to have a smoke. And it was terrible because if you didn't smoke, you weren't going to get anywhere in your career. So, every now and then... Did
you have to do working smoking?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, back in the day. But having been brought up in a French school where people started smoking aged 15 in the roundabout outside the school, I think...
Those French roundabouts.
The French roundabouts outside of French schools. I do think that this is probably a good idea because, France is so stuck to its cigarettes. And I was just there this weekend with a friend who smokes, who I went to school with, probably picked it up at school. And they still love that sort of slightly renegade ability to light up when everybody else is outlawing it. So I think that what they're doing here is, hitting people hard and just saying enough is enough.
That's all we have time for today. Thanks to Nina Dos Santos, Charles Hecker and Guy De Launey. The programme was produced by Desiree Bandley, Mariella Bevan and myself, and our studio engineer was Steph Chungu. I'm Emma Nelson. Monocle on Sundays back next week. But until then, enjoy the rest of your weekend. Goodbye and thank you very much for listening.